Wanted to introduce Dr. Timothy Bray. He is the director of the Institute for Urban Policy Research at University of Texas at Dallas. And he's also on the faculty for the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at UT Dallas, where he teaches public policy, political economy, social data analysis, research programs, and teaches graduate and upper division courses in quantitative methodologies and structural correlates of social disorganization. You have to explain that one, Dr. Bray. He also serves on the Institute's National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, and he received a PhD in criminology from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And prior to earning his doctorate, he was an assistant bureau chief with the Illinois State Police, where he headed the strategic and operational research units. And after leaving the state police, Dr. Bray was awarded an achievement medal for his innovative approach to solving contemporary and traditional policing issues. His current research focuses on the development of multi-dimensional indicators for quality of life and disparities in quality of life, and the collective efficacy of private-public community-based partnerships. His research includes the development and application of hierarchical models to explain variation in neighborhood levels of social dislocations, including assessing and controlling for spatial dependence in the data. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a deliberately long story.
Okay, well, you'll have to share it at some point with us. He's a native of St. Louis, and he has a wife and 5 daughters. Thank you, Dr. Bray, for coming. And now we want to hear from Heath Cheek, whose company developmentally sponsors TREC Talks.
I don't have much to add beyond what Lori offered, but thank you all for being here and welcome to TREC Talks. Bell Nunley is proud to sponsor TREC Talks again this year. And Dr. Bray, we look forward to hearing from you. We know that Dallas is an urban city in a state that is increasingly urban, and as Texas is becoming more urban, it may be a difficult concept to wrap our heads around the fact that this is an urban state rather than a rural state anymore, since so much of our land mass is rural. But Texas is home to 3 of the country's most populous cities: Dallas, Houston, and Austin. Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio are all just one huge urban mega region, according to Rice University's Kinder Institute. This evening, Dr. Bray will be bringing the discussion closer to home when he addresses the politics of land use and whether there is a need for regional thinking when it comes to land use, housing, and commercial development. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Bray.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that kind introduction. Lori, I apologize. You got the academic version of the bio, which is inflated, I think is the word to use, with as many syllables as possible, because that means something somewhere. But I do appreciate the warm welcome. My background is in criminology. I was trained as a criminologist at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, after having worked for the state police in Illinois and for local police departments in Missouri. I wound up going to graduate school, coming to UTD to teach criminology, spent about 3 years doing that, and then was recruited to start what was the J. McDonald Williams Institute, started by Don Williams of Trammell Crow background. We did a lot of work in communities, and in 2008, we brought that institute back to UT Dallas, where I had never really left the faculty, but came back in a different capacity, and over time began teaching more in the public policy space, having watched the interaction of state, local, and to some extent regional conversations in Texas. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Here's one, and let's see here. And share, and screen, and share, and voila. I think we are sharing. Okay. So in that context, I wanted to sort of just tee up a conversation tonight, and hopefully more of a conversation and less of a lecture on what I would title regional considerations in development. And I titled it that way. And as I shared with Lori, we had several conversations. I used to be on the board of the North Texas Housing Coalition. And we convened a group of mayors once. These were mayors from all over North Texas. And we were down at the Dallas Fed, and we posed the question, do we have a regional housing strategy? And the answer, of course, from the mayors was no, which on paper is correct. We do not have a regional housing strategy. But that doesn't mean that builders are building without any strategy. The strategy that they're using is designed to achieve the goals of their companies. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the net result is it's sort of hit or miss. And it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of everybody in the community. Not that needs aren't being met, but it's a little bit more scattershot, right? And so the argument that we don't have a regional housing plan is somewhat untrue, because we do have a plan. The plan is to maximize the return on your investment in your housing corporation. And so that keyed up a conversation about what regionalism would look like. And so I want to toss off a simple definition of what we mean when we say region, right? And this idea of a regional landscape. And I would say that the knitted fabric of our lived experience is regional, but the institutions governing our experience are fixed in time and space. Now, all that means is this: think back to March of 2020, as COVID restrictions are starting to come out. We don't know much about how this disease is working, and Dallas County shuts down restaurants. And the county judge in Collin County says all jobs are essential. We're not shutting anything down. But then McKinney shuts some things down, but not Plano. Then Plano shuts some things down. It's not like nobody from Dallas County drove across the county line and went out to eat in Richardson, right? Or went out to eat in Plano before Plano restaurants closed. We have a very regional lifestyle. But a lot of our infrastructure is still managed, planned, and executed at levels of government that aren't necessarily regional, county and city, all right? And I would just point you to Dallas City Council member Kara Mendelson, whose Dallas City Council district has residents living in Denton County, Collin County, and Dallas County, and whose pursuit during the pandemic was to get one picture of what's going on with COVID in her district. And she can't, because the building blocks used to discuss COVID were county level government entities, all right? So we pose a really interesting conversation. If we say region, and we should be working together, it introduces some what we would call systems thinking problems, right? And the first is we have to define what a region is. Now, this is a definition that I like from Douglas Powell. And Powell says, and this is the longest block of text, by the way, on this PowerPoint deck. So for those of you who love text, this is your treat. Region, then, is not a thing in itself, a stable and bounded object of study. My assertion, Powell says, is that just as community is for Raymond Williams a warmly persuasive word to describe an existing set of relationships, or the warmly persuasive word to describe an alternative set of relationships, region is always at some level an attempt to persuade as much as it is to describe. Because the set of relationships intersecting at any one point on the landscape is potentially unsummarizable by any one account. All attempts to, all versions of region are necessarily partial, and hence an attempt to persuade at the very least of the validity of their own particular definitions. And let me, okay, I'm gonna get away from that because I wanna sum up for you, right? Regions are purpose driven. We create regions to put a box around things we want to manage. Regions don't exist on their own. Regions exist because someone has created them, and regions are fluid, all right? The definition of a region changes as the purpose changes. Regions are socially constructed. We all agree to what they are. regions themselves lack authority because they're socially constructed. And regionalism is a verb. Now, I wanted to toss out a simple example. We're going to come back to this example on the next slide. The Dallas-Fort Worth Airport and the phrase Metroplex. Metroplex was a marketing term created with the launch of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport to convince people that there was a region here. That's where Metroplex came from. And Metroplex, believe it or not, I found out from the former chancellor of Dallas College, formerly the Dallas Community College District. Metroplex has a loaded history depending upon who you talk to in North Texas. All right. So some folks prefer that the region be called North Texas. Some folks prefer Dallas-Fort Worth. The folks in Arlington really appreciate the census definition, which is Dallas-Fort Worth-Arlington. And some folks just call it Dallas and just call it Fort Worth. All of this is to say that we have, when we go into a conversation about regionalism, we find ourselves having to first confront what the heck do we mean by region and who's in and who's out. So a very brief history of our walk down the regionalism lane in North Texas. I'll start with a story that I was told, many of you have probably heard it as well, about Amon Carter and his lunch. Amon Carter was mayor of Fort Worth, and the story goes that Amon Carter would always bring a sack lunch when he had a meeting in Dallas because he refused to put a dime into the Dallas economy. Now, I've heard it from enough people that I'm convinced some part of it is true, but I'll admit that the only people who've told me are Dallas people. So I'd be interested to learn what the Fort Worth version of that story looks like, right? I use this story to sort of frame this conversation that regionalism can be a gamble. In some perspectives, there's something to give up. There's a power exchange. When we talk about shifting gears, when we talk about working together, by definition, some of our autonomy disappears, which is why I introduced the Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport. Left to our own devices, we would not have a DFW regional airport. We have a DFW regional airport because the FAA got involved and said, we're not funding 2 airports anymore. That instigated a conversation that was overdue about how our 2 cities, and at the time it was basically the cities, work together on something, right? Now, it is a long and storied story, I guess is the way we would say that, right? That even got into, those of you who are here long enough know the Wright Amendment, and the Wright Amendment, which forbade flights to any state that didn't touch Texas out of Love Field in an effort to encourage folks to use the Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport and not Love Field. And, you know, I have a very good friend who works for Southwest, and the story at the time was, if you called Southwest and said, do you fly to St. Louis? The answer was no. We don't fly to St. Louis. We fly to Little Rock, and we fly from Little Rock to St. Louis, but we don't fly to St. Louis. They weren't even allowed to book you a ticket that way. Again, in an attempt to urge regional collaboration. And for those of us who are new to North Texas, we kind of just take Dallas-Fort Worth Airport for granted. But it was actually a battle. It was a long battle that wound up, you know, I think working and serving us very well, but there's a reason that it sits exactly half in Dallas County and half in Tarrant County, right? And it has to do with that collaboration and that shared power. And then one that, you know, I remember fondly from my work with Dan Petty, formerly at the, and now of course the name escapes me, but Dan worked on the Olympic bid and the Super Bowl bid. And Dan liked to use this phrase co-opetition, right? And his argument was, instead of us going as the city of Dallas and making a bid for the Super Bowl and the city of Fort Worth and making a bid for the Super Bowl or the Olympics, let's go as a region together. And then once we win it, we can fight about who's going to get the AFC hotel and who's going to get the NFC hotel. But in the meantime, we make a much stronger argument working together, right? So over a course of about 60 years, you began to see a real shift in the regional perspective in North Texas. Now, we haven't completely warmed to the idea, but we are further than we were 50 years ago. So some examples about this fluid scale. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the Transit Agency, the the Regional Transportation Organizing Group that goes to the Highway Administration for dollars, they encompass roughly 12 counties and parts of another one. The Census Bureau's Dallas-Plano-Irving Metropolitan Statistical Area, 7 counties, but 7 counties defined socially with a different set of criteria. The MPO is designed around a shared highway infrastructure. The MSA is designed around who has commercial connections with Dallas County. The even broader Dallas-Fort Worth-Arlington core-based statistical area, 13 counties. The regional chamber, an unstated number of counties, right? Truly, you understand when you talk to the chamber that Dallas is a concept, not a map, right? They include an argument for things beyond just the city of Dallas, to the point that you now have an East Dallas Chamber of Commerce and an Oak Cliff Chamber of Commerce. These regions overlap. And finally, the one that we'll come back to in just a second is, the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and it's a framework in Texas, the Council of Government framework, which includes a 16-county region. It really is a framework for us to look at for managing regional approaches. So the Council of Governments gives us, for instance, they are the home of our Metropolitan Planning Organization, our transit organization, so to speak, that goes and does highway planning. They do have some work in building code development, right? But here we have a place where elected members from every county and every city government have a seat at the table and discuss planning issues. They're at a variety of they're at a variety of points in formalized networking in these, and we'll talk about those in a moment. I just throw that on the table as I think what is a really good example of a way we could be doing it, right? So, for instance, we have a regional stormwater management coordinating council. All of the cities and county governments at the table talking about how we handle stormwater runoff, how we handle drainage, how we handle environmental impacts and concerns. There, of course, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the MPO. They handle our highway, our work with the FHA. And then finally, not through the COG, but rapid transit, right? We have a governing body for the Dallas area rapid transit that includes member cities' elected representatives. So different cities who are participating in DART have a different number of seats at the table where they make a set of collaborative transit decisions. Now, in another conversation, we can talk about ways we could actually do transit a little bit better, which might include not requiring cities to buy in. We're not quite there yet when we talk about regional development or land use planning. Now, we have land use data at the region, but we still have a lot of siloed decisions being made within cities about what's going to go where and how. And we'll talk about the implications for that. And again, we don't have a regional housing plan. Cities are making housing decisions. But as I'm sure you have examples, there are folks who live in the city of Dallas who don't work there. There's folks who work in the city of Dallas that don't live there. We should be having a regional conversation around housing. Okay, now, in 2006, Fry and his colleagues released a scale for talking about collaboration, right? And I want to show you each of the steps on this scale, and then we can talk a little bit about where different organizations are connecting. So at the bottom of the scale, you have siloed operations. We might be pleasantly aware of each other, right? My city and your city might acknowledge that the other exists, but we have no use for each other. We really don't consult on decisions. We just do the things that we choose to do the way we choose to do them. Once you elevate to a level of networking, you are working with your peer cities, all right? But independently. In other words, and I think I just dropped everybody's faces on my, there we go. Things are moving around on my screen. You're aware of each other, but you make your own decisions, but at least you're talking. So in the case of a regional planning effort, we might let each other know if we've landed a new employer. We might let each other know if we have a new commercial development that's coming to our city. But that's the extent of it, all right? Think of it as a cocktail hour. We're sharing comments and information. The next step is where I think we're starting to see some traction. When we cooperate, we share information, and we have a formal regimented communications process. We have a way of talking to each other. Now, think about this as the way that our cities and counties work with each other. City, county quite often have a formal method of communication through interlocal agreements that governs the relationship between the county and cities, or two cities might have an interlocal agreement that governs, for instance, mutual aid and emergency response. We're aware of each other, and we have a regular method for exchanging information, but that method is formal. When we step up from cooperation and we get into coordination, we begin to share information and resources, all right? So we start going after collective, for instance, funding sources. And we have some shared decision-making. So think about this, for instance, as what we're doing with, for instance, DART, all right? So in DART, we have shared decision-making, and we have and we sort of have a vote, if you will. Everybody's got a vote at the table, but I'm still doing as my own city, my own transit things. All right. I'm involved in DART, but I'm doing other stuff in my city that might not have anything to do with DART and is still in the transit space. Coalition, we begin to see we begin to see a sort of a shared responsibility. All right. We prioritize frequent communications around a set of topics. And here, there is no action without a vote, all right? We don't move forward without each other. Think here now about like our MPO. So our Metropolitan Planning Organization, once we as a city, as an MPO, decide to go to the Federal Highway Administration and ask for dollars, another city doesn't go and do an end run and also go up and ask for some extra dollars on their own, all right? So there is shared action, shared responsibility, but we still have individual organizations. And lastly, we have what we would call collaboration. Collaboration, these organizations belong to a single system and build consensus on joint actions. This is a level of interoperability that we very rarely see. So think about collaboration as like the joint metro governments that you see in some Florida cities. Nashville, I think, has one, right, where there's a city-county shared government. They function as one. That's a level that, that's still a little bit far away from us in Texas. I would suggest that, when we think about land use planning, when we think about sort of a coordinated approach for commercial development, we're probably at networking, right? Our cities are talking to each other about what's going on. There may be some cooperation on borderland issues. So I'm thinking of the Plano-Frisco border at 121 and not the tollway, but in Collin County, right? We have Plano and Frisco working together on things, but not in any sort of a long-term way. Long-term meaning around a set of goals. I think, when we were talking to mayors about regional housing plans, the number one takeaway that we got was that mayors, when you say plan to the elected leaders that we spoke to, they saw it as restrictive. That when we talked about a regional plan, they were thinking about them having their hands tied. One of the mayors said, it'll be a cold day in hell before anybody lives above a store in my town, right? We were talking about mixed use development. That town, by the way, this was 10 years ago, that town has a dozen or so mixed use developments now. But his read of his people at that time was, it would be a cold day in hell. And if I enter into this regional plan, I have to commit to do things that aren't in the best interest of my city, right? So, as we start talking about how to engage our government leaders around these sorts of shared planning opportunities, I think what we have to help them recognize is it's already happening. But a lot of times our governments are not at the table. Developers are making regional decisions because they're building in multiple cities. They're investing in multiple cities. But there's not on the government side of the house, there's not necessarily something for them to plug into on a region-wide level. So we wind up with what we would call the good old-fashioned opportunity cost. For starters, we have a hell of a loss of efficiency because you're making, as a developer, lots of one-off requests and lots of one-off sort of deals, right? You're dealing with this city here and this city over here, and each of those cities may have a widely different set of expectations, development costs, permitting processes, stages of the development plan. One of the great ones that we've used as an example was the tree offset that the city of Dallas had that basically resulted in dampening development in southern city of Dallas because there were so many trees you couldn't possibly put one tree back for every tree that you took off to build the parcel, right? That sort of thing doesn't exist in northern Collin County, where all of this recovered farmland in Anna and Melissa has absolutely nothing encumbering you, although you might have some trees along a creek line. Your bargaining or your decision surface is constantly shifting because as cities race each other to attract development, your decision surface constantly switches. So who's got the best deal today may not be who has the best deal tomorrow, which results in a shorter time horizon for planning purposes, right? You wind up really having a difficult ability trying to lay out, let's say, a 2 or 3 year roadmap, because a lot of our cities are still coming into their own, especially the newer suburbs. Growth has vastly outpaced the infrastructure that they've got, and their long-range land use planning is coming along, but it's subject to change because they don't know when the next Nebraska Furniture Mart is going to come in and decide it wants to make a substantial development, and when that happens, they reevaluate their entire plan. And that's a good thing, but the reality is, absent a fixed structure that plugs into, it's very difficult for them to make the sort of trade-off decisions. And so I would leave with that, what we have is sort of a regression to the mean. There's a city that neighbors us, and I'll slip shortly into less of a commercial side and more of a housing side, but land use decisions matter. We have a number of developments, Sunnyvale in Dallas County, Lucas in Collin County, where early desires were, lots of 1 acre residential lots, little commercial development, But that has real implications for sustainability for local municipal services, like the ability to staff a police department, the ability to support schools in the community, right? If no one ever moves out of their home, then when your kids are gone, you find yourself where where Lovejoy ISD is, where they're shutting down an elementary school because the population has shifted. So all of this is to say, and the COVID pandemic has rattled our cages enough to help us realize this is really a thing, right? This lack of planning, this lack of an infrastructure that is coordinated across more than my little city or your little city is something that really does inhibit our ability to grow as a region. I was fortunate enough to participate in a regional planning exercise for North Texas that COG was putting on several years ago. And there is not a singular vision about what North Texas should be. There is not a singular vision about how we should be arrayed. So should we have lots of skylines, Frisco, Irving, Richardson, with this sort of nodal design? Or should we have a strong central, big city pile in the middle and everybody lives on the outside? We've got city planners who are operating under different modalities in that space. It creates also the lack of a forum, the lack of a place for us to have this conversation, right? I think places like TREC are a place to begin this dialogue, but we've got to engage with the COG. We've got to find a way to engage local government around the need to have a wider perspective than just the projects in my city or just my city's 5-year horizon. And with that, I'd like to leave some time for conversation. So, Lori, I'll throw the question and answer slide up. I said I didn't want this to be a lecture because the semester ended this week. So with that, I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation and less of a talk.
I'll jump in. I have a question.
Yeah.
So Dr. Bray, I was wondering, to what extent do you think some of the planning has occurred in a way that we have really facilitated the growth and the development and the attractiveness of the suburbs at the expense of the city? So when I think of transportation in terms of the development of the tollway, certainly, where you increased the ease of access for people to live in the suburbs and come down to the city. But it's not just within transportation. I also think about, I am sure there are people in a variety of different cities within Collin County. I grew up in Plano myself, that have their own sort of regional artistic groups, like, chamber symphonies or things like that, but certainly nothing of the caliber that I would say of like the Dallas Symphony, or the ability to attract some really large dynamic things that we will then host, within Dallas proper in the arts district, and people will come and we might benefit from how they will spend their money for the evening should they decide to eat out here. And yet facility maintenance and things like that, that burden is not spread regionally. And I was wondering sort of if you could comment on that, and what are some of the ideas that you might have for how to solve that, acknowledging it's not a problem to be solved, but an issue that will need to be managed.
Well, and so I would start with, from a systems thinking standpoint, and I teach a course on wicked social problems, which is a sociological term for problems that are seemingly intractable. And one of the things we talk about in that class is that there are boundaries within which these decisions are made. So cities have city councils. City councils exist already, right? So they're making land use plans. There's a vehicle by which those conversations are facilitated and happen. There is no there is no simple, regular, recurring dynamic by which Richardson and Dallas are talking about how they're going to develop along 635 or Spring Valley, right? That's just not a conversation. That's not a place. There's no place for that conversation. And so you have these, what we would call interstitial spaces where what happens. Because it's not just the training that has sort of resulted in the suburbs. It's that there's not a dialogue by which we connect. When I first got involved with the Williams Institute, there was this conversation about is Dallas on the same path as Detroit, with where you have this sort of emptied out city, right? And a city doesn't work like a donut. The region can't survive a weak Dallas. We have to have a strong core to the many things you just mentioned, Courtney, right? Fine arts, right? Do we have that fine arts hub? Do we have a commercial hub? I think one of the things that's different in North Texas is we're beginning to see a model where we might be growing a nodal system. We have a financial core that isn't in downtown Dallas, right? We have industry segments that are popping up at different places in the region, and things like the tollway are the connective tissue that connects these things together. I think, when we talk about economic development, when we talk about economic activity, that we have an event that attracts people, that books hotel rooms, that keeps our restaurants busy, those sorts of things, those conversations tend to happen in places like the Chamber. And the Chamber is connected to all the cities, but the cities don't necessarily connect to each other in a formal, regularized way. I think one of the other things that's happened in the suburbs is I'm told, I'm not a developer, I'm told it's cheaper to develop in the suburbs because the land is already flat, the trees are already gone. You're taking a former field and turning it into a subdivision or turning it into a commercial development. I'm thinking of the villages at Allen and the villages at Fairview, right? Great commercial developments, largely flat land there to begin with. You didn't have to clear a lot of trees. It was sort of a turnkey operation. I think that's been a real boon for the suburbs. They're starting off ahead of everybody else to begin with, right? I think on top of that, when a lot of this was developed, you had a fairly unsophisticated development system in the suburbs. And so they weren't trying to burden you with a lot of extra steps that an older city like a Dallas might, because they've been around the block a couple times, right? So I think, where we need to do, and this would, again, TREC, the Chamber, both very well situated to be a place where this conversation can happen. I know city planners in Plano, I know city planners in Dallas. I think they're eager for these kinds of conversations, but those conversations are informal, right? It's who you know, and your network is sort of sharing what's going on. There's not a vehicle by which these communications are regularized and strategically engaged in. That's the piece that's missing. I feel like I just did another lecture. I apologize. Did that even remotely answer the question?
It does. And so since I don't have a lot of people, it looks like that I'm competing with to ask, I'm going to jump in and ask another one. So as I've mentioned, growing up in Plano with a, largely single family community types of developments, and was certainly somewhat aware in early adulthood of their seeming disdain for apartments and apartment dwellers, although you would certainly have your 2-story to 3-story, sometimes garden apartments throughout, and have looked at some of the decisions that they've made in regards to zoning, where in some ways it seems like they have just really doubled down on trying not to allow that. And when you juxtapose that a little bit against what we have going on with Dallas, we sometimes wonder if the amount of single family housing that we have within the city where admittedly participating in that myself, where you kind of want to dip your toe and get some of the benefits of single family residence while you still stay very connected to, downtown only being truly a 15-minute max type of
Right.
a commute or things like that, and have just sometimes wondered if the revolution that has to occur is sort of this decision to say, no, the city of Dallas, in order to address housing, in order to become a world-class city, has to simply become far more urban, which means if you want to maintain a single family type of a lifestyle, unfortunately, you're going to have to simply move further out because this is not a part of our vision to the future. And I was just wondering if you could weigh in on your opinion of that idea and what some of your thoughts are.
So yeah, I mean, I think so. The multifamily, single family divide. As I'm sitting here, I live in Allen, and I'm looking at materials from 2 runoff candidates that were left on my door on Saturday, and one of them says, "I prefer single family neighborhoods over multifamily developments. Neighbors and neighborhoods made Allen what it is today. Let's grow it that way." As though you don't have neighbors in a multifamily development, right? There is a lot of value positioning going on in that sentence, and very often, multifamily is synonymous with poor. Although I can't afford to live in any of the multifamily housing that people are proposing to build up here, right? A $500,000 townhome is outside of my my price range. But I think where you're getting at, Courtney, is there's a density, right? There's a real demand for us to achieve the density required to support. Sorry, I'm not sure what that was. There's a density required for us to support the way of life that we desire to be. I remember 2005 or 6. It was a big milestone because 5,000 people lived downtown, and the morning news ran a big story about how 5,000 people lived downtown. But in a way, that's a barometer for the vitality of the city, right? When I first started working down there, you'd come out of the office at 5 o'clock, everybody was shutting their businesses down, everything was done for the day. That's just not a vibrant space, and multifamily is a key to that. Now, I think my preference is mixed use, mixed income, mixed format, right? That you have to have a product that attracts all walks of life, that has both commercial development and residential development to create that sort of community vitality. And I don't know that you can't do that if you think of West Dallas and La Bajada, and you've got sort of the condos coming up on the south side of Singleton, and you've got a lot of the original single family. My fear there is, when we looked at housing in Dallas for the wholeness index, we looked at what someone could afford making the median income in the city, right? And you have a whole swath of single family homes where it's all affordable. I can afford 3 or 4 of them, right? They're $25,000 each. And then you have this gap, and what's happening is, and I think it's still that way, although less, middle income families are leaving the city, right? They're going to Mesquite, they're going to Garland, they're going to Grand Prairie, they're going to Cedar Hill, where they can afford a middle income home, because we don't have that product in the city. One of the ways we can get that product in the city is in multifamily. Because now the trick is, with things like Clyde Warren and Main Street Park and these other sort of community assets coming online, you can begin to create a place. Oh yeah, there's a place to walk the dog. There's a place for the kids to go play. It's not apartment living tailored to single or dual income, no kids. There's a family feel to that. I think, the trick is, and people have said this for some time, until we get families in downtown Dallas, we're not going to truly reach that density and that urban vibe that we need. I think that portends interesting things for like the M Streets and Hollywood Heights and East Lakewood, and these sort of because they are abutting commercial development along Gaston. They're abutting commercial development along Greenville. I think there's a way for those to still exist, right? But you may take that commercial frontage and look at developing a higher density residential along the curb there, right? Where you get that mixed use, mixed income, mixed format development.
I'll jump in. Courtney, I'm also a Plano Plano grad, so it's the Plano hour this evening. But actually, I grew up in Parker, which is near Lucas. So yeah, that's another one of those communities that's a 2-acre minimum.
Yep.
And so very, very much an anomaly, especially with everything growing up around it, with Murphy and with Allen and Wiley and all of the other municipalities that are kind of, I mean, literally growing up around us. It is really unusual to find a municipality like Parker that has, I mean, virtually no development except for South Fork Ranch, and has no intention of supporting any kind of development except for what we've got. So it's rare. This is a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for joining us and doing this for us. I was really struck talking about the Olympics and the Super Bowl. I also think back to Boeing. And of course, you know, HQ2 here with Amazon. And, you know, I think that the Dallas Regional Chamber did a fabulous job of bringing us together. You know, I think about how we put together our bid and, you know, the things that were revealed to us about education and how vitally important that is to attracting corporations, our transportation infrastructure. So, you know, I also go back to the note that you made about Amy Carter and this, you know, ongoing rivalry between Dallas and Fort Worth. You know, it is interesting. You know, we have a Fort Worth office because we can't do business in Fort Worth without it. And, you know, people who, you know, with JPS and some of the bond packages that are coming out, they will want to see a Fort Worth address and an 817 area code, you know, as part of our bid for those types of projects. And so to me, you know, it's interesting because, you know, we also have an Austin office, and the image behind me actually happens to be some of our work at the Domain. And so when I think about the Domain coming up as sort of a second downtown for Austin, and the huge amount of dense development that's there, you know, it's interesting because I sort of see that, and I think you referenced that in Irving and Plano and some of these other municipalities that are building up largely corporate development versus, you know, Las Colinas that has the urban center, and there's much more of a mixed use there. But, you know, I look at what we have learned from things like Boeing and HQ2 and some of these other things where we're in competition with other regions. What should we have learned from all of that stuff? What, you know, if we're trying to create a nucleus or some kind of a combined front for these things, and you talk about building cooperation, coordination, developing a coalition, and then finally collaboration. I mean, those are the kinds of things where I see our region really needing to come together and be more proactive and foster those kinds of discussions so that we can be ready for the next one. And, you know, if it means we need, you know, 6 different downtowns, I'm not suggesting that's likely, but it seems like, you know, those are the kinds of things that ultimately corporations that look to relocate, and certainly TREC and the DRC are really active in those types of pursuits. So what can we be doing to bring ourselves together in advance of the next one?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, you know, the story I was told about Boeing was that one of the CEOs and their wives, or at least one of the wives, came in, you know, in an unguided self-tour, and were shocked to see that everything was closed in the evening in downtown, right? And, you know, I contrast that with just a few years ago, I was at an event for UT Dallas down at the Jewel, and I mean, there were people everywhere. And there were car lights everywhere. It was just fantastic. I think, you know, the word that keeps coming back to me is vibrant and identity. Chicago's got an identity. Seattle's got an identity. I think Dallas is honing in on an identity. I think we're coming out of the oil tycoon J.R. Ewing 80s brand, right? And, you know, we're starting to get a sort of young, hip vibe tech. I go back to, you know, we did a little bit of quantitative work for the chamber on that pitch for HQ2, and we looked at young adults and who's moving into to Dallas and who's moving into Uptown and things like that. I think we need to have more of vibrancy. We need to have more of life. And I mentioned early on, right? Regionalism is a verb. It's not. It's yes, it's a noun. It's a way of looking at things, but it's a dedicated activity, right? And so organizations like TREC, like the Greater Dallas Planning Council, where we've got voices from all over the region, these are really great ways of creating that fabric that ties us together. I think strategically we need to take that next step, right? So what does it mean to create a policy council, so to speak, where we can, and some of this is going on at the COG. So for instance, the COG has a great exercise where they look at which cities have adopted which building codes, and they promulgate what they would sort of call a model building code for the cities in North Texas, and they want them all to sort of grab onto that. What if we had something like that around form and place and placemaking? I think placemaking is a real, it's a real departure from just filling up the land. And there's the Sam's Club that Dallas approved, completely in opposition to its land use plan, because a buyer came along and wanted to do something, and we were so hungry, right? And I think a lot of cities they want to see that development, and they don't often recognize that their power goes beyond the power to say no, right? They have a power to shape what that engagement looks like and how that development contributes to the lived reality of neighbors. And so I think that the sort of next step, right, is for us to lock into that that appropriate role of city to connect the fabric of their community through the development work that they do, and then to connect cities. And a great example in the Parks and Rec space is the trail networks. Our cities are talking to each other on where the trails will connect and things like that, and they're deliberately developing trail networks so that we have hundreds of miles that you could bike. We don't necessarily do that in the built environment, at least not to the same degree. I think partly that's because most trail development is, government funded, or private donors who have given money to the government to build the trail. There's not a third party commercial voice in the room. And yet when I talk to a lot of the commercial folks, they want that. They want what they build to be a part of something bigger, right? I think there's an appetite for that in the commercial community that cities would be well advised to rise up and meet, help us be a part of what's going on in this community.
How does the regionalism, when you're kind of actively doing it, and it is supposed to lend itself to a cooperative, a teamwork type environment. But I think Brooks had a really good point in terms of, area codes, for example, and doing business in Fort Worth. And there is truly this huge desire for an 817 area code. And I find that in a lot of different industries, it's sort of grown beyond what I thought it once was. And yet at the same time, you have a region that hangs on very tightly to the Dallas identity, right? I mean, UT Dallas, not UT Richardson, even though it is not in the city of Dallas.
That's right.
And there have been, you look at, I think kind of similarly within the UNT system where we do have the Dallas campus, and yet, there's a lot of that branding. In some ways, it seems like that is what attracts, is that just the identity and the history of what that means. Is there a way to or are there any other cities that you can kind of point to that were able to find a way to use that strong pull or that desire to identify, even when it is not located within that, to the benefit of that other city?
Yeah, so part of the challenge is our size. We're far bigger than, I think of Charlotte, Mecklenburg, where, you've got Mecklenburg County, you've got the city of Charlotte, but you don't have another city the size of Charlotte 30 miles away that thinks they should be the Charlotte, right? And so we have this, we have a branding in Fort Worth, which is distinctively different than Dallas. Dallas is oil, Fort Worth is cows and cowboys and sort of that Wild West. And I think we've got to find a way for both of those identities to exist, right? That there is that there's a mega identity, which is DFW, that is bigger than the tech glitz side of Dallas and the sort of laid back Sundance Square vibe that you have in Fort Worth, where both of those are complementary, and they contribute to each other. I've got friends in Fort Worth who like to come and hang out in Dallas. I like to go hang out in Fort Worth at Sundance Square and eat on the patio, and it's a great symbiosis. And I think if we could ease into this fact that we are actually symbiotic, that what's happening here feeds off of what's happening there, then you get less of that. We work with a lot of nonprofits and city governments, and somebody was really upset that we had a contract and we weren't in the city of Dallas. Now, admittedly, my building on the campus is in the city of Dallas. It's as far north as you can go in the city of Dallas and still be inside. But, I don't think that's what people meant, right? They didn't mean, oh, well, wait a second, you're 3 feet into Dallas, so that's okay. That was a proxy for something else. And this is a sort of a tension, right? Well, do you live in Dallas? No, you live in Collin County. Well, yeah, but when Tom Leppert was elected mayor of Dallas, in a way, I was excited. The decisions Dallas makes, the decisions Fort Worth make, affect the whole region. They don't simply affect the siloed vacuum of the city of Dallas. And so I really do think if we could embrace our differences, right, that we actually have much more diversity in our region than a whole lot of places do. I don't know Minneapolis, St. Paul that well. I've been to a couple conferences there, but I get a sense that there's a much greater difference between Fort Worth and Dallas than there is between Minneapolis and St. Paul, right? And I think that works to our advantage. If you're talking about luring corporate development, you could be, your employees could find any one of a dozen places that are radically different. You go south of I-30 and you've got lots of hills and lots of green space. But if you want big sky, it's north of Tollway, right? When you get this sort of big flat, big sky, watch the clouds roll in, you can have either one of those and be 30 minutes from work. That's a real win for us. But we kind of have to rise above it, which is, we've been on this journey since the 40s. We'll still be on it.
I don't know how much time we have left, but this notion of binary cities is pretty fascinating. You can name quite a few. Raleigh-Durham is one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I have some friends that are there, and the Research Triangle thing is such a productive and kind of amazing thing that they've managed to create there. It seems like are there examples, and is that one of them maybe where some of these binary cities have really worked well together?
Yeah, I think that's an example. I think we have a lot going for us in North Texas. I think that the universities are working together in ways we haven't before, right? We're having conversations about degree plans. And, when we started our criminology program at UT Dallas, it was in consultation with North Texas that of who's going to provide what and how they're going to connect. So I think that we have all the ingredients, right? I think what we're missing is the policy and structural framework for these to happen. Like we have with the MPO, we don't really have a solid footing where government can engage and shape policy around what the building community is doing, what the residential community is doing, what corporate needs are. I mean, the chamber's asking. The chamber knows what businesses are looking for. You guys know what types of space people are looking to. We just built a new school in Allen, a new middle school. It's radically different from anything that I ever went to school in, because the way kids learn is different, right? Those are the types of things that the idea of bigger, I'm working with a church, and they're talking about an educational building, and the building they're going to build now is not what they would have built before COVID, right? Much more open space, much sort of bigger flex space to accommodate all sorts of spacing and distancing, which wasn't a concern before. I think, I think that we are in many ways on the cutting edge of this stuff. Again, simply because of our size. Nobody else is a 1.2 million person city, in a 2.1 million person county, in a 6 million person region, right? We're sort of the Hulk in the room. But we also still deal with our Bruce Banner Hulk dichotomy, right? That I think we haven't quite figured out Professor Hulk yet, if you'll pardon my Marvel references. But I think that we're a lot further ahead than we give ourselves credit for, because we are so close. So I do think finding a way to stitch this into permanency, where we kind of get that policy environment interacting with these collaborative environments where a lot of these conversations are happening. That's the next step. And Lori, I apologize. I didn't know if we were going till 6 or 6:30. I don't want to ask for another question if I'm already 3 minutes over. You're muted, by the way.
Oh no, we're going to 6:30. So
okay, good.
People
good.
have as much time.
Yeah.
To ask.
So what? Yeah. What other questions?
Well, on the one hand, it's, as I looked at the diagram that you provided, and the end result being collaboration, that automatically means you've got to have people that are leading in a very cooperative way. And so I think back on, what I consider to be favorable years of, Mayor Rawlings and Mayor Price, and how well they got along and things like that. And I think I didn't realize at the time how great that was for the entire region. But if you don't have that, then I cannot really think of anything other than having perhaps those two, or if you create it with, even this kind of policymakers round table of sorts, what would be the entity or that group that would come in and serve that role?
And so you brought up something which I forgot to mention, right? We often think of cities as somewhat homogenous, but they're actually two different entities. There's the elected side, and then there's the staff side. And in a way, it's great that the two mayors got along, but if the two staffs don't get along, then having worked in government, you keep your head down. In 4 years, the politician's going to change, and the winds are going to change, and you just wait long enough, and we'll get back to business as normal. One of the things we talk about are in my Wicked Social Problems class is types of knowledge. One of the types of knowledge is called organizational knowledge. think of this as the knowledge that you maintain about how to navigate the building department, the building codes department at a city, right? Organizational knowledge is automatically oriented towards maintaining the status quo. That's why change is so hard, right? When someone says, well, it's the way we've always done it, one of the reasons it's the way we've always done it is because the knowledge, we produce forms, we produce policies, we produce directives that are designed to ensure it's always done the same way. That negates change, right? And so almost you have to have a disruptive event, and I'll go back to criminal justice. Think about the impact of the social unrest after George Floyd. Conversations that police departments have not wanted to have for decades are being had in earnest, right? Because this disruptive event created a space for us to break out of that cycle of how we've always done it and look instead at what a different way might be. I don't know what the disruptive event would be in the building space, right? I mean, you could imagine some sort of natural disaster that caused everything to fall down and we've got to reinvent ourselves. That's not where we're at. I think to the extent we can create the mechanisms that connect our staffs, right? So that the American Planning Association does this for city planners, right? But it's more of a social and professional development than it is about a forum for creating model codes and things like that, right? So I think that there's, the Council of Governments is probably a really good starting place for because all of the folks are already at the table. It's simply, hey, do we want to tackle housing? Do we want to tackle commercial development beyond the sort of joint code, municipal code that we've all got? Can we talk about prioritizing economic development that's tied to our MPO? So if we know where we're going to lay the next big highway redo, would we start focusing our commercial development in those corridors? I suspect it already happens, but it kind of happens because somebody knows somebody who knows what's going on, rather than a coordinated and systematic approach where we would sort of get down and together and say, okay, let's prioritize this highway because we've got a lot of commercial activity that wants to come into this space, right? I don't know that happens in a strategic way rather than an ad hoc way.
Well, it's interesting in mentioning COG, because I remember with our former transportation director, when it was coming to issues around 345, for example, I just remember sort of a quote that he gave that was something along the lines of, COG is no longer going to dictate what kind of a city we are and how we are, laid out and things like that, because there have been a lot of emphasis, I think, over what COG said they could or couldn't do in regards to 345. So it's, when you mention it in terms of like, well, there's already this structure, maybe we just tap into that. Just some of my limited exposure to that has been like, well, they seem to do things that are good for the region, perhaps, and make it very easy, when I think of it, primarily as transportation, as a way to get around, that has created some of these issues that we're continuing to.
Yeah, that's right. We've made it easier and easier to get up to Sherman.
Right.
Well, but the other side of that, and I think you bring up an important point. I'm not suggesting, I don't think, that the existing frameworks are the ones, but we have a place, right? We have the forum. We need to constitute a different group that meets there, so to speak, right? We have a place where we already have membership. We already have an established set of meetings for transit, or maybe we change how we talk about transit, right? It's less, and this has been a criticism, not just of COG, but of most transit in Texas, that the conversation always devolves to pavement. It always devolves to concrete. It never devolves to rail. It never devolves to, some of the the other things that are also transit that other regions are talking about. Other regions are talking about high-speed rail. Other regions are talking about a meaningful expansion of light rail or bus lanes or things that are that both decrease pollution and increase connectivity, right? And that, you know, these two conversations maybe go hand in hand. You know, Mike Morris used to say we can't pave our way out of this problem. You know, there's no amount of highway we can build that's going to accommodate another 10 million people in North Texas. So that's not the reality. We've got to look instead to density, which I think is itself a building problem, right? Looking at how we revise code to allow more density. Think of the City of Dallas and auxiliary dwelling code, right? Where they're really, can we tweak this so that we can have auxiliary dwelling units on this property because somebody wants to rent out that garage and the house over the garage on their super large lot, but we weren't allowing them to. So it is a wholly different conversation than one that we've had before. So you're right. There are a lot of reasons why just tapping into an existing forum at the COG might not be the way to go, but the place exists. And at least the expectation is we all belong to it because we're already doing it for stormwater. We're already doing it for some of these other areas. Can we figure out how to do it for the built environment?
Lori, I don't know who else is on if they have any questions.
See.
But
I can't see the whole because I'm sharing my screen, so I can't scroll that easily.
you're on mute. I'm not certain if you're talking to us. So
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I'll offer just because no one else is talking. You know, we have an internship program that's been funded by the Kuhn Family Foundation, and we're tackling we tackle the issues that directly affect poverty, and transportation and development are, you know, the easiest way to get somebody a job is to build a building where somebody's going to come and open up an office that needs employees, right? I mean, that's a simple solution. So, you know, if you've got things like this that you want to bat around, you know, we're always looking for little projects for the students to tackle. And if we can sort of articulate the relationship to poverty, we've got a group of probably next semester 10 students who will be available.
Okay, well, I'm gonna jump in and ask then. This will be my last one, I promise. So the ADU, which I thought was a really interesting point that you brought up, because to me that feels like a no-brainer in terms of being able to provide mixed income housing and things like that.
Yeah.
And yet, in one of our candidate forums in District 14, for example, you know, one of the questions I asked is, it seems as though they support density as long as it's not in single family neighborhoods. They want it, you know, over on the side, giving it, you know, an increase in the FAR, things like that. And the comment, and he went into detail to try to explain his belief about how it actually increases property values because people then go out, and ADUs end up costing, he said, on average $200,000. And I think that's a separate conversation. But I saw it as an illustration of sort of a belief that I have that a part of what keeps us back is that we do not have a strong mayor form of government, and truly dynamic cities have strong leaders that are guiding in a way where they are not simply one of 15 people sitting around a horseshoe. So in that type of a conversation where, understandably, as you're trying to win a race and you're going to try to do it every 2 years, and if the majority of your district is made up of single family homes and they've decided that that's the way they want it to be for a myriad of different reasons, right? That ultimately is always going to hold us back from, and so I'm curious if a part of a regional perspective, if would a strong mayor potentially kind of gum up the works or not necessarily help or contribute, or would it finally be a way of having somebody that speaks with a voice, not just collaboratively the way perhaps Price and Rawlings did
Right.
together, but as somebody that can actually stay in and say, like, this is going to be the plan for the region because I am the largest city within this region, and this is what we're going to do, sort of a approach, which admittedly does not follow along with that very collaborative era that you had going. And, I understand.
Well, remember, it's collaborative if somebody goes with you. But you can be the one who announces it. I think you bring up a good point about the form of government, right? And I mentioned the sort of the bifurcated, you've got staff on one side and you've got elected leadership on the other side. And that, frankly, it tends to make us slower to respond, right? Because you've got the mayor wants to do X, the city manager wants to do Y. It takes, 13 out of 15 votes or something like that to terminate a city manager. It's very hard to sort of exercise that political capital. And frankly, when we were working with the mayor's poverty task force, one of the big differences, because Mayor Rawlings patterned it off of what was going on in New York. New York has a strong mayor. So when the mayor decides we're going to do X, Y, Z, the police chief has to do it, or the police chief doesn't have a job. The housing department has to do it, or the housing department doesn't have a job. We don't have that carrot and stick format here, right? And so, it's not impossible with council manager form of government, but almost you need the manager, the two city managers, to be having those events rather than the two mayors. And that, I think, is something that city staff is not necessarily, we celebrate people like a strong mayor system, even though we don't have a strong mayor, right? Where the mayor comes, everybody applauds, the two mayors talk, but that action layer doesn't automatically happen like it does when you have a strong mayor system. So yeah, maybe we need to have a city manager's forum, right? Not necessarily the elected leaders, but instead get the city managers together to talk about these issues. And I will say, I've had occasion to work with several city managers. They're ahead of the curve. I mean, they really are thinking about these things, because the other side of that is, you've got 2 terms as a mayor, but you might have 30 years as the city manager. And so you really are vested in what's going to happen here. Your job depends upon, you're going to be measured against what's happening 15, 20, 25 years from now, in a way an elected official won't.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bray, for all your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lori, for.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bray. This was so informative, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Courtney, for asking really great questions. I appreciate that. Well, I think we're going to wrap up. And this was very enlightening. I like I said, to be repetitive, I truly enjoyed what you had to say and how you pointed out things that we should consider from a regional perspective. And so,
you're welcome. I'm always happy to work with the great folks at TREC. I love what you guys do.
Oh, great. Well, we'll eventually have you back, I'm sure, in one form or another. And have a great evening. And thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.